So how do you see that working with developments in poetry today and in literature, the existence or disappearance of, say, regional writing or place-based writing, or different categories, different media that come into play? Because on the one hand, the person with the headphones may be listening to poetry or to music or to song of some kind, oblivious to something else that's worth a poetic experience.
Well, you know, it's interesting, if you think of great movements in arts, I mean, the poorest place in the United States in the Depression, maybe even today, is Mississippi. The poorest part of the Mississippi was on the Delta, and the poorest people on the Delta, you know, were the rural blacks. That's where blues came. It was a locally produced music, and it eventually changed world music. But it was very much of a time and a place and a culture and a sociology and a climate. And I think you can see that again and again. I mean, in the Renaissance, the way they painted in Siena was different from how they painted in Florence, which was different, even though they were only, you know, not that far apart, which was different than how they painted in Venice. And there's this sense of being in a particular time and place, we see the world. I mean, if we are incarnate beings, we see the life from our body, where we are, when we are. And out of that comes a reality, a kind of vividness of identity, of reaction. And what interests me is that at the moment, there's a kind of, across all the arts, but you know, you see it very clearly in poetry, is a kind of placeless homogenization. Everybody wants to write like everyone else. And I think this, you know, and I you know, it's sort of a little bit like Gertrude Stein's, you know, cruel remark about Oakland. There's no there, you know. There's no here there, you know. And so you tend to see the novel, a style that comes through, a novel style that comes through, and it's, you know, and it strikes me as a kind of mannerist. And some of the poets that I really like the most are people that seem to me very much, you know, of a particular milieu. I mean, Thomas Hardy, Constantine Cavafy. I mean, Eugenio Montale is this, you can't imagine anybody more cosmopolitan than Montale, but he's from the coast of Genoa, you know, and you know, the plants, the sun, the sense of the sea, the sense of the rocks, there's an immediacy about it. And, you know, and I worry that we're losing that. And that's part of us having the, you know, having the world asking to be described. I mean, you know, and I think, you know, and I guess I'm so old-fashioned. You know, I believe in reality. You know that it's not all. You know that, you know, the Pacific Ocean is not entirely a cultural construction. You know, it has little fishes in it, and has has waves and everything else like this. And that part of what we're doing is what poetry is, what art is a kind of dialectic. You know, we're having, you know, with the world. You know, of which we ourselves are part of, which human things are part of, you know, and the more generalized that becomes, you know, in some ways the less tasty, you know. I'd rather go to we talked about restaurants earlier. I'd rather go to a Hungarian restaurant than a world cuisine restaurant, you know.
So it's the importance of particularity.
You know, when you asked that question, I took it to a different place in my mind as you were talking, and I immediately thought of the whole larger situation in terms of publishing in general, literary publishing, which is widely said to be in many ways in trouble on many fronts. But I think what strikes me from where I sort of look at the world is that paradoxically what is really, in a sense, problematic for the more commercialized and market-driven, even, you know, literary fiction, the difficulty of, you know, sustaining the same kind of publishing and sales numbers that were true 20 years ago or whatever, is that something very different has happened with poetry, in the sense that poetry was always under that radar. It's not affected in one way by changes in the sort of larger commodity market of literature. And what I'm noticing, and I don't know how this will bear out and what it will do for fostering the art at large, but I am noticing just a tremendous small scale, targeted, very often regional, highly energized, grassrootsy, you know, the flourishing of the small press against all odds. It
It's
seems
the
to
local
be-
food market.
Yeah, the local food
know.
market of
Right.
poetry seems to be doing
Like the farmer's market.
fairly well for itself, or at least it's doing as well as it has ever done, while others, you know, are sort of dropping in profile. So it appears to be vigorous.
Yeah, you know, I mean, let me say that, I've been talking about larger issues, but I actually think, in a funny way, the situation of poetry is pretty good right now, because, you know, if I've written a novel and I say I'm going to read you my novel tonight, the room's going to clear. As I'm going to read you a poem, you say, well, maybe I'll, one poem I'll listen to, and poetry, because it is so primitive, because it predates, print technology, is portable. It's inexpensive. Doesn't require sets or symphony orchestras, and so as our culture moves away from print and more back towards the auditory things, a poet can actually perform his or her work in more places than they ever could, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. You don't have the support of the mainstream culture. Newspapers aren't publishing poetry the way that they used to. And in the 19th, up into the early 20th century, the American newspapers where people read poems. I mean, they printed them in every issue, and people liked them, and editors reprinted them. But we do have a little bit of this kind of do-it-yourself, culture. I mean, you could now start at the tip of Florida and walk across the continental United States and find a venue to recite your poems in every night. They might not pay you, but there'd be bookstores and cafes and schools and synagogues and all these places that have poetry readings. And that's a kind of and if you think about this, in our culture, which is obsessed with money, which is obsessed with the price of everything, there remains some people who do some things out of love, that have pulled a few things out of the marketplace, and the poet is their bard, in a way, is their symbolic figure. Right. That being said, it is a very much of a direct thing. We are back in the situation that Oog and Gronk were as tribal poets. It's just us folks in the cave tonight that are going to hear this poem. But that may be the natural habitat of the poet.